This week on Q&A, our guest is Bethany McLean, whose book has just been released by Penguin Publishing. It's called All the Devils Are Here, The Hidden History of the Financial Crisis.
Bethany McLean, when we last visited 5 years ago, Ken Lay was alive, Jeffrey Skilling and Andy Fastow had not gone to prison. And you had written a book called Enron, The Smartest Guys in the Room. Bring us up to date. Do you know of where everybody is today?
Well, Ken Lay is in his grave, although questions to the contrary persist. But I actually, as conspiracy theorist as I am, do not think there's any truth to that particular conspiracy. Jeff Skilling is in prison, although his conviction is currently on appeal at the Supreme Court. And Andy Fastow is still in prison as well.
I want to run a very brief comment that you made about how you felt back then 5 years ago, and then we'll continue to talk about your new book.
I've definitely become more cynical than I would like to be about corporate America and about whether people tell the truth and about whether people live up to the responsibilities that being a corporate citizen entails. I think our American system makes it possible for people to make great sums of money, be they accountants, lawyers, members of boards of directors, corporate executives, and I'm not sure that the concurrent or commensurate level of responsibility comes with that. I think the corporate culture has been corrupted by this get-rich-quick notion. Make your quarterly earnings estimates, get the stock to go higher, get your options in the money, and cash out. And you know, who cares what happens next? I'm gone, and I've made my money. And I see that pretty frequently, and I think that's just such. I think that's really terrible, not just because it's a betrayal of responsibility, but it's also a betrayal of possibility.
Would you change anything?
I would almost say that I wasn't cynical enough, because if you had asked me back then if we were going to have another financial crisis, this one much bigger that makes Enron look like a canary in a coal mine or just the little hiccup before the big explosion, I would have said, oh, it can't possibly happen for a while. We've learned some lessons, surely. And I would have been completely wrong.
Correct me where I'm wrong, but your life has changed a lot during the last 5 years. You were living in New York,
I was.
And now you're in Chicago.
Correct.
You've remarried.
I have.
Do you have children now?
I do.
How many?
I have one child and another on the way, so.
And then you were working for Fortune, and now you're working for Vanity
Correct.
Fair. So tell us, before we get into all the rest of this stuff, how did all this happen?
Well, I met my husband in the world's most surprising way. He was actually the prosecutor on the Enron team. He was the lead Enron prosecutor, and we were both divorced at the time we met, and lo and behold, strange, I guess people meet in all sorts of strange places, and life takes some very strange twists, because if you had asked me when I lived in New York and worked for Fortune if I would ever leave Fortune or ever leave New York, I would have said absolutely not, and here I am.
And why going from Fortune to Vanity Fair? What do you do with Vanity Fair now?
You know, in a way it's not so different, and I loved Fortune and I'm extraordinarily grateful to the magazine for the freedom I got when I was there. Vanity Fair is one of the few magazines that routinely runs very long investigative pieces, 7, 8, 9,000 words, and even Fortune only rarely does that. And so there's a little more freedom of subject matter at Vanity Fair, although right after I got there, the financial crisis really hit in full force, so I found myself doing just the same sort of stories I probably would have worked on at Fortune. But it was mainly for me. I'd spent 13 years at Fortune and my entire career as a journalist, and that was all I knew. And I think it's important to you learn something about yourself by moving to a different place. Sometimes good things, sometimes bad things, usually both. But those are important lessons, I think.
Bringing everybody up to date, born in Hibbing, Minnesota, 1970. Williams College, graduated in 1992. Spent 3 years with Goldman Sachs, 13 years with Fortune, and went with Vanity Fair in 2008.
Correct.
Up to where we are now, brand new book. This book is called All the Devils Are Here, The Hidden History of the Financial Crisis. Where'd you get the title?
You know, just as our publisher came up with the title, The Smartest Guys in the Room, I have to give credit for this one to my publisher. They came up with the title, but it's actually a line from Shakespeare. And as soon as we heard it, my co-author and I both said, that's perfect.
Where did you start thinking about this book?
We started thinking about it in the fall as the financial crisis was hitting in full force, September 2008. My co-author, Joe Nocera, who was my editor at Fortune and then who edited The Smartest Guys in the Room, was in Chicago actually working on a column, and we were sitting in my house, and he said, we should do a book together about the financial crisis. At that point in time, we thought it was a unique, original idea. We were soon disabused of that notion. But, and I thought, I wasn't so sure about embarking on another book. The last one was a really difficult process, and that was still too fresh in my mind. But I have the utmost respect for Joe and the ability to work with him again, plus be able to spend a couple of years thinking about something that I was really interested in and delving into all these tales that otherwise I'd never really be able to delve into. I thought, okay, sign me up.
Well, as you know, there have been a lot of documentaries and other books written. How is your approach different from everything else?
I think it is a really different book. I fully believe that you only have in you one book. Then you can't. You may think you should write a different book, but you can't do that. And so from the very beginning, we wanted to tell the history of the financial crisis. We wanted to go back 20 years in time and talk about all the things, all the various strands that had to come together in order to create this. And they're very different strands, and pull it together into a narrative. And we definitely had moments of second guessing that when, for example, Andrew Ross Sorkin's great book came out, and it's just this wonderful blow by blow of the meltdown on Wall Street, and you think, oh, should we have done that? And of course, at that point, you also think, thank goodness we didn't do that. But I think the book that we wrote, the book that we set out to write, and it has ended up being pretty different than anything else that's out there.
Explain the difference.
Because it really goes back in time. It starts in the 1980s with the invention of mortgage-backed securities, or the modern invention of mortgage-backed securities, through the characters who were there at that time. It traces the growth of both subprime lending and of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac in Washington, D.C. It traces on Wall Street the growth of various means of measuring risk and other financial tools like credit default swaps, and it traces the changing morality on Wall Street, and it really tells you the history of Countrywide. So it's a different, and it ends right with the conservatorship of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac in the fall of 2008. So it's not a blow by blow of the meltdown. It's rather a history of the events that led us up to the meltdown, told in, I hope, a character-driven narrative way.
Why did you start with this sentence? Stan O'Neill wanted to see him.
It's a fascinating example of I think the power that one man has over a company, and the really untold story of how Merrill Lynch, once one of America's great companies, was brought to the brink of destruction, only saved by a last-minute merger, through really just the actions of a few people and this chain of events that is almost just remarkable in hindsight, where this incredible exposure to these disastrous subprime mortgages accumulated on its balance sheet without Stan O'Neill, who was then the CEO of Merrill Lynch, even knowing that was happening.
Where is he today?
He is, I think, still trying to recover from what happened at Merrill Lynch. This crisis, although I suppose I have over the years, as much as I say I've become more cynical, I've also developed, I guess, more sympathy for the mistakes that people make and the devastation that they suffer when they make those mistakes. And I think it's easy to look at a man like Stan O'Neill or a man like Angelo Mozillo and say, send them to hell. Look at what they did to our economy. Look at the money they took out of their companies. But on another level, these were very proud men who believed in the companies they created, and will always be remembered as failures because of what happened. And that, to them, I think is worse than any prison sentence could be.
I suspect there are a lot of people watching right now that say, I don't care what happens to those people.
I suspect that too.
Not only that, I hope they suffer. Do you have any evidence at all, and you have out front in this book 100 names of 100 different players in this whole story.
Yep.
Do you have any evidence that any of these folks that ran any of these big financial institutions are suffering?
Any evidence? Getting to know people through the course of reporting a book you come to see what means the most to them, and the extent to which people are define themselves by their professional accomplishments and their pride in what they think they've built. So it comes down to a question of what you call suffering. To Americans who have lost their homes and are struggling to meet their bills in the wake of the financial crisis, no, these people aren't suffering. They're not suffering in terms of material wealth. If you think about your sense of the world and your faith in yourself being destroyed when you're 60, 65, 70 years old, and having to look in the mirror with a very different reality than you thought you were facing, I think that can be devastating. And I'm not saying it makes up for what people think they've done. I'm not saying it's suitable punishment. I'm just saying there's a human level of pain there.
Take Stan O'Neill. He ran Merrill Lynch. How big was Merrill Lynch?
Merrill Lynch was a huge company at its peak. It was one of the 5 big broker dealers on Wall Street, employing tens of thousands of people. It was the thundering herd. I mean, it was an immensely proud company with a really long history and legacy, and all of that's gone. And Stan O'Neill was a man like some in American business who really came from nothing and beat back incredible prejudice and rose to be a really prominent African American CEO. And there's a tragedy in his fall, as much as I think when you read the book you see that he brought it on himself.
And I don't know how you pronounce the fellow's name. Is it John Bright or Bright?
John Bright.
Bright. Your prologue, which is only 3 pages long, is about John Bright. Can you give us some background on what happened there that made you lead the book with that?
Well, he's really a risk manager who came to understand how bad Merrill's exposure to the subprime mess was, and he had been sidelined under Stan O'Neill's Merrill Lynch, which is really how this was able to take place, how Merrill Lynch was able to accumulate all of this junk on its balance sheet without anybody knowing. It was the slow sidelining of risk management, a critical function on Wall Street, but one which I think we've all discovered exists in name only at many firms. And over Stan O'Neill's tenure at Merrill, it was slowly dismantled and pushed aside in a way that O'Neill didn't even understand what he was doing. So this story that we told at the beginning of the book is about this moment of realization that doom was upon us, and it's to me a very human story, which is part of the reason why we wanted to start with it.
Did you talk to John Bright?
We can never, for most of this book, as in the Enron book, most people didn't want to be quoted. There's still enough. While the government has not brought very many, if any, well, a few criminal cases, there's still enough noise swirling around all this that people don't want to be dragged into it. So the book relies fairly heavily on anonymous sources.
Well, the only reason I ask is because you actually quote John Bright in here and Stan O'Neill, so one or the other, it seems, had to talk to you.
Sometimes quotes come from third parties who observed the events and were in the rooms, and other times they come from people who were there.
Can you give us some examples of people who refused to talk to you?
Let's see, people who refused to talk to us. Well, one person who I would have loved to have spoken to, and he didn't so much refuse as was unable to talk to us, was Roland Arnall, who died in the spring of 2008. And he really, in many ways, was the pioneer, the founder of subprime lending, despite the fact that Mozilla is often given that honorific or extreme negative. And Arnall is just a fascinating character. It stayed very, very private man, not a well-known name because he never took any of his companies public, and never was the CEO of any of his companies. Other people were always the face person, and he became a huge political donor and was appointed the ambassador to the Netherlands by George Bush in 2004. 2006, when his company had just settled the largest predatory lending accusation by the state attorney generals ever. And at the time, which is just astounding, no one paid attention to this. Wait, once the largest subprime lender in the country just paid $325 million to settle accusations of predatory lending. Is something happening here we should all be aware of? And it rolled off. It rolled off all of us, I think.
What did he die of?
He died of esophageal cancer.
And go back to the founding or the person that invented subprime mortgages. Where did it start?
It really started out of so-called hard money lending. So the practice of, say, somebody buying a refrigerator and paying an exorbitant interest rate in order to, and the loans would be heavily collateralized, and this grew into second lien mortgage lending, where people would take out these, really high interest rate second liens on their homes in order to basically pay for their daily expenses. And the hard money lenders were a small, kind of tough bunch who really excelled in knowing their consumer and getting enough collateral that they got their money back. And with the slow liberalization of the laws surrounding the mortgage lending, which we recount in the book, and then the end of the S&Ls, first the liberalization of the rules surrounding what S&Ls could do, and then the end of the S&Ls, you had a whole new breed of people start mortgage lending, and it really took off in the 1990s. And the thing that fed it, in addition to this relaxation of the rules, was the advent of securitization. Because in the past, if you were a lender, you would have to find somebody to finance your loans. And if you were a small fly-by-night lender, well, how did you get the cash to go out and make mortgages? So you had to corral together investors, and it was a slow, painstaking process. But with the advent of securitization, you could bundle up these loans and you could sell them to Wall Street, which would sell them on to investors in the form of securities, which could get a really high rating from the credit rating agency by virtue of all these financial engineering techniques. And so the business just exploded. And you had this really what we like to call subprime 1 in the 1990s, which was the first wave of subprime lending, and really ended badly, and is just another shocking canary in the coal mine type example, because people didn't pay any attention to the fact that this ended really badly once before.
Can you still buy securitized loans of packages of mortgages?
You can, if they go through Fannie and Freddie. Right now, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the two government-sponsored entities that were taken over by the government, are basically the only game in town. And so investors are unwilling to buy mortgages unless they have Fannie and Freddie's stamp on them, meaning that basically now they are explicitly backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government. Whereas in the so-called private market, which was these companies that would sell their loans directly to Wall Street, and they wouldn't have a government guarantee on them, has been pretty much shut down in the wake of the crisis.
In your epilogue at the end of your book, you say, perhaps the most glaring omission in the new law was any mention of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Mm-hmm. With everything that happened in the 2 years since the crisis, neither the administration nor Congress has done anything to change the status of Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac.
Yep.
Why?
Because it is such a difficult problem to answer. Fannie and Freddie, the government-sponsored enterprises as they're known, became deeply embedded in our housing market. They are part of what's known as the secondary mortgage market, and it's this invisible part of the machinery of finance to most Americans, but a very critical one. So Fannie and Freddie would buy mortgages that were made by mortgage makers, by originators, stamp them with their guarantee, meaning that nobody had to worry about the credit risk because Fannie and Freddie promised you'd be paid back, and turn around and sell them to investors. And they became enormously controversial companies, enormously powerful, politically powerful and financially powerful, which the book traces, and enormously just controversial. And in the wake of this, you'd think when the government has to take them over and we're on the hook for untold billions of losses, you'd think, obvious, shut them down, right? But without Fannie and Freddie today, we don't have a mortgage market because there are no private lenders who are out there willing to make loans. Fannie and Freddie and the FHA, the Federal Housing Administration, basically account for the mortgage market today. So you're in this conundrum of what do you do? How do you yank these enterprises out from under the market when they are the market?
Tell me where I'm wrong. Just as an observation, we do not know anything about Fannie and Freddie today. They're not written about in newspapers to any degree. There is no face on them. Yeah. We don't know who runs them. We don't know how many people. I suppose we can find out how many people work there. But I remember we asked one time just to get a list of the board of directors, and they said, we won't give that to you unless you write us a letter.
Did they really? That's astonishing. It's, you know, it's interesting. They were always such an odd mixture of partly public, partly private, partly government-owned companies. They were huge forces on Wall Street, but they were located in Washington, D.C., so they were always these strange breeds of companies. And now that they're owned by the government, in effect, they're even stranger, basically, because they are run by their regulator, so run by the government, and it's really hard to determine for what purpose they're being run. Are they being run to minimize taxpayers' losses and make as much money as possible, or are they being run to support the housing market, possibly at the cost of to taxpayers? So it's you're right. There's a shroud of secrecy over them now.
Did you talk to anybody at Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac?
The book focuses extensively on Fannie Mae, so it's safe to say I talked to a lot of people who used to work there. But most of the old Fannie Mae people are gone. When Fannie Mae was put into conservatorship, it had to fire its CEO, and most of the top executives left. And that's, you know, one thing Fannie Mae people will complain about. Well, Wall Street firms didn't have to fire their CEOs when they took the government's help.
Your third chapter is The Big Fat Gap. And it starts out this way. In 1991, David Maxwell retired as the chief executive of Fannie Mae. He was 61 years old and had held the post one day short of 10 years. He walked away with a lump sum of $27.5 million, most of it accrued retirement benefits, but still a shocking sum of money for Washington during that era. And this is an outfit that had a board of directors that included 5 presidentially appointed members. Yep. $27.5 million. Now, I know that's not even the highest figure that you've gotten out of people that have worked there.
No, definitely not. You can argue that David Maxwell earned his money. He took what was a failing enterprise. It was on the verge of going broke when he stepped in and turned it into a phenomenally profitable enterprise, and one that I think during those years did decently manage these twin goals of being profitable while also supporting the housing market. But over time, and I blame the change in Wall Street culture a lot for this, Fannie and Freddie got seduced by the same enemy that so many corporations fall prey to, which is just relentless profit growth at all costs. And if you're supposed to be a mission-oriented company that is supposed to have this other reason for its existence beyond producing profits, that becomes a pretty difficult conundrum over time. And the big fat gap in the title refers to a way that Fannie and Freddie made inordinate profits, which was taking advantage of their ability to borrow money at a very low rate, because investors assumed they were backed by the U.S. government, and buying mortgage-backed securities with that and basically just earning the difference. And it was Alan Greenspan, who became a big foe of the GSEs, who referred to that as the big fat gap.
So what did David Maxwell, is he still alive?
He is.
Did he talk to you on the record?
He did, yeah.
And what did he do over those 10 years that was specifically that saved Fannie?
Well, he took a company that was the Washington Post had an article that said it was heading toward the biggest disaster in modern financial history, you know, going broke at a phenomenal rate. It was run kind of like a government enterprise without a lot of focus on its bottom line at all. And it, like many of the S&Ls, had bought mortgages and at a time of rising interest rates, and so was stuck with fixed rate mortgages paying one thing while its cost of funding was going through the roof. And so money was just going out the door every single day. And Maxwell started to run it more like a business, demanded accountability on the part of managers, changed some of Fannie's policies and procedures so that they no longer commit to buying a loan at any interest rate from someone, you know, a year in advance, and then be stuck with that loan even when it had turned out to be unprofitable. So you could argue that Maxwell set Fannie on the course of being a bottom line oriented company, but like everything in life, there's a balancing act.
Well, you point out that he passed it on to Jim Johnson, and I'm reading from your book, a Democratic operative, a tall 47-year-old Minnesotan, and a graduate of Princeton. Johnson was, as they say, a player. He had spent his 20s working on the campaigns of Eugene McCarthy and George McGovern, and then served as Vice President Walter Mondale's executive assistant during the Carter administration. Did Jim Johnson get the job because of his political connections?
I think it was a mixture. I think the political connections were almost a deterrent at the time. I was told a story about how some of the Republican board members were incredibly offended by Jim Johnson and didn't want him to become the CEO of Fannie Mae. But he did have these deep political connections, and I'm sure that David Maxwell was savvy enough to see how important those would be to Fannie Mae in the coming years, because Fannie was constantly fighting this battle with Wall Street and with others in the mortgage industry that wanted some of its very lucrative turf. But Johnson was also a businessman. He'd worked at Shearson Lehman and had enough of a business background that he wasn't a pure political operative.
You quote him saying, "We're going to cut them off at the knees."
He was rumored to be regarded as a very, very tough operator by the people who worked under him and by people who dealt with him. A take no prisoners attitude. And some of that was bred into Fannie Mae's DNA. They always had this sense that people were trying to kill them off, and it was true. Fannie always had foes in the government who would have liked nothing better than to see the end of Fannie Mae, and so the company always felt that it was fighting for its very survival. And so over time that hardened into this very, very fierce take no prisoners approach to the world.
You know, most of the media have put Paul Volcker on a pedestal during this process. And the reason I mention that is because you write here in 1990, even before Johnson took over as CEO, Fannie Mae engaged Paul Volcker, the legendary former Federal Reserve Chairman, to defend Fannie Mae's low capital levels.
Yep. I think it is a testament to the low risk that everybody believed mortgages had. And in fairness, they probably did have that low a level of risk. What people at the time couldn't have foreseen or didn't foresee were the changes in the mortgage market that made mortgages carry a much higher level of risk at the time, and the changes in Fannie's business that led it to carry far more leverage than it did then.
So over the years, why didn't the government pay much attention to them?
Oh, they did. People tried desperately, particularly the Bush administration, to rein in Fannie and Freddie. Alan Greenspan would actually publicly say that their portfolio, the amount of mortgages they held on their balance sheet, needed to be capped. And the very blunt answer is that Fannie and Freddie were simply too politically powerful for anybody to do anything. Well, in a sense, that's too blunt an answer because people were also scared. People were scared, as they are today. What happens if you take them out of the mortgage market? What happens if they're right and the housing market can't function without Fannie and Freddie? We'll get the blame. And so there was both a paralysis due to their political power and a paralysis due to fear.
What role did the foundation play, where they had money that they spent on philanthropic projects throughout Washington? They contributed tremendous amounts of money to politicians, and there was a constant revolving door of politicians coming in and out of Fannie and Freddie.
The foundation is a part of why Fannie's lobbying apparatus was regarded as the most politically powerful, potent force that people have seen. I've got a quote in there from former Congressman Richard Baker saying, basically General Patton couldn't have stood up to them. It was 24/7, and never anything left a chance. And people talk about the sheer amount of money that Fannie and Freddie spent lobbying, but that pales in comparison to the other ways in which they bought influence, whether it was via the foundation or whether it was via these partnership offices that they opened all over the country, or the revolving door, as you mentioned, that people went back and forth between Fannie Mae and Washington, D.C. Tom Donilon, who will be Barack Obama's new chief of staff, was once a high-ranking Fannie Mae executive.
You mentioned Richard Baker. Didn't he leave the Congress to head up a trade association in the financial world?
That he did. So the revolving door is nothing unique to Fannie.
You write up, you have a chapter where you talk about Robert Rubin and I believe Larry Summers. Yep. There are three of them total involved in it. Again, this whole business of people coming in the government, going back to the financial industry, coming back into the government. Mm-hmm. How much of that did you find?
There's an awful lot of that. There's an awful lot of that, and I think you can look at that through two prisms, and you can look at it through one prism in which you say, how great, people make their money in the financial world and then they come to the political world to share their wisdom and their insights into the real world with the rest of us. How wonderful that these people, after making fortunes, are willing to give that up and devote time to public service. You could look at that through a far less benign lens and say that the ultimate form of corruption is not someone explicitly doing someone else a favor, but the form of corruption that happens when everybody already thinks the same way. And that if you have this revolving door, particularly between government and Wall Street, you're likely to get a lot of people who think the same way in positions of power. And then you don't need explicit corruption. You don't need any favors because you all already agree anyway.
So what have you found? I mean, you got a big book here, almost 400 pages. Was this preventable?
It was preventable in the early years. By the time 2005, 2006, I think it would have been very difficult for one person stepping in to have taken an action that would have prevented what was coming. But so the crisis isn't a story of, the crisis as we've told it isn't a story of big decisions made by big people. It's a story of corruption or venality or wrongdoing or inventions simply gone wrong, pushed to a place they weren't meant to be taken. It all layers. And so you had to have this transformation of subprime lending. You had to have the mortgage become this product that it had never been, in order to provide basically the raw material for the leverage that eventually took the system down. You had to have this unwillingness to rein in the amount of debt that was in the system for it to become a problem, and you had to have the invention of all these complicated financial tools on Wall Street. And so you had to have these disparate things kind of come together to make a crisis of the size that we had. So I think it was preventable in numerous ways, or at least mitigatable, is that a word? In numerous ways along the way by regulation or oversight of derivatives, by tighter regulation of investment banks, by smarter regulation of banks and investment banks, by some sort of action in the mortgage industry, given that was the shocking thing to me, were the warnings from consumer activists starting in the 1990s about predatory lending, and yet you didn't have the federal regulators do much of anything until 2006, when it was far too late. So preventable, yes, but in the paths along the way, not in something someone could have stood up and shouted from the rooftops in 2006. We're going to have a financial crisis unless we do X, Y, and Z. Does that make sense?
What did you do when you were at Goldman Sachs years ago in the early 90s?
I worked for 2 years as an analyst in the investment banking department in Goldman's mergers and acquisitions department, and then I spent a year working for what's known as the Whitehall Funds, which at the time was a Goldman fund that invested in distressed real estate. What
did you see there?
You know, I was very young when I worked there, and probably younger in fact than I was in years. I was a naive kid from a mining town in Minnesota who found herself working on Wall Street. It was an eye-opening experience in terms of, I would say, how hard people worked and how motivated people were by money. And that stood out to me. I came away from Goldman Sachs in my time there as an admirer of the firm. I wouldn't say those were the easiest 3 years of my life. In fact, in some ways, I'd say they were the hardest. But I felt like I grew up a lot and learned an immense amount by working there. And so, I guess I have retained a level of loyalty to the place over the years.
What about during this time period where this whole business of them getting bailed out?
Yep. I think my view began to change. I did and I was always an admirer of Goldman's success too, and of their, unlike other firms on Wall Street who merely talk about risk management, Goldman Sachs actually practices risk management. But there was always this underlying complaint about Goldman Sachs that you would hear whispered. Nobody would ever say it on the record, but that the Goldman culture had turned rapacious, that it was profits at any cost, that this whole notion that their first business principle was our clients come first was just completely meaningless, that they would run over a client in the search of enriching their own bottom line. And I listened to the complaints, but and they were loud enough that it was hard to discount them. But it was also really hard to find any proof that this was happening, because nobody would go on the record and complain about Goldman. And to me, the really telling thing about the financial crisis was that it does show how Goldman's culture had changed since the firm had become a public company. And it's really hard to look at their actions during the financial crisis and say that this is a company who believes that our clients come first, unless you very narrowly define the word client.
A couple of weeks ago, Frank Rich, who is a liberal columnist for the New York Times, wrote about this. And I was reading your book and his column at the same time, and I want to read it back to you just to see what your take is on this. He said, no matter how much Obama talks about his tough new financial regulatory reforms or offers rote condemnations of Wall Street greed, few believe there's been real change. That's not just because so many have lost their jobs, their savings, and their homes. It's also because so many know that the loftiest perpetrators of this national devastation got get-out-of-jail-free cards, that too big to fail banks have grown bigger, and that the rich are still the only Americans getting richer.
Yep. I'm not sure I would put it exactly the same way that Frank Rich does, but I don't disagree with the sentiments underlying that. It is indisputable that really sick, dare I say, byproduct of the financial crisis is that too big to fail firms have gotten bigger, that we bailed out the biggest institutions, which became even bigger and more powerful, and now we have even less diversity among financial institutions. Why not just break them up, make them into small firms, so we don't even need to go through all these legislative contortions about how you make a firm fail. And I think it will be very difficult if we are faced with the failure of one of these firms to actually let it fail. And I think that the underlying issues of the financial crisis have not been fixed at all, and indeed there's no easy fix. And they are, one thing is similar to what we talked about when we talked about Enron 5 years ago, and it's this culture of short-term greed. If I can get mine and get out, then who cares what happens after I'm gone? And that's an attitude that I think is pervasive across Wall Street. There isn't a sense of a larger right and wrong, and I don't know how you fix that. The other issue to me is that this crisis, people want to phrase this as a crisis about home ownership. In other words, this was a crisis caused by putting people in homes that they couldn't afford. And it really wasn't. If you look at most subprime loans, they were used so that people could do cash out refinancings of their homes. In other words, use their home like an ATM card, because people aren't making enough money to support the lifestyles that both they and our economy have gotten used to. And that's a huge underlying problem. That's not a quick fix about America's home ownership policy. That's not any kind of quick fix. That's just a huge underlying problem. And I'm not sure what the fix is to that.
He writes a little more about the banking industry, and he said he called it an outrage. This is Frank Rich. It's disregard for the rule of law as it cut every corner to process an avalanche of foreclosures. Clearly, these financial institutions have learned nothing in the few years since their contempt for fiscal and legal niceties led them to peddle these predatory mortgages and the reckless financial products concocted from them in the first place. And why should they have learned anything? They've often been rewarded, not punished, for bad behavior.
I think, unfortunately, that's that is mostly true. I would caveat it by saying that some of the banks who are engaged in the foreclosure mess today are not the same firms that were involved in peddling subprime mortgages, and it's easy to put everything under the rubric of the financial industry, but in fact it's quite a mass of disparate actors. So it'd be nice to be able to hold Bank of America up and say, well, it owns Countrywide, therefore it's accountable for all of Countrywide's sins in the past. But if the executives and the people who ran Countrywide are no longer there, is Bank of America really accountable? I mean, legally they are, but you see where I'm going, since this is an ethical question. But I do think it is the for better or worse, the story of the financial crisis is a story also of trying to find the line between venality, greed, corruption, outright fraud, and most of it is somewhere in the murky middle. And as much as we may abhor certain behavior, it may not be criminal. And you can't, just because you are disgusted by behavior, you can't say it's criminal when it's not. And I don't believe that firms aren't being prosecuted because of some sort of political agenda not to prosecute them. The Southern District of New York is a very independent and powerful prosecutor, and if they were finding myriad examples of prosecutable fraud, they would prosecute. You know, the Countrywide case against Angelo Mozillo and a couple former executives settled on the eve of trial, and it settled because it was a civil case, and it settled because the case wasn't ironclad. And it's a very tough thing to come to terms with, because we as a country, we like our villains. You know, makes us all feel better when we've suffered something as devastating as this, to be able to hold up something and say, look, that's what's to blame. And when you have instead this murkiness, it makes the whole thing even harder to comprehend.
Are there still such things as credit default swaps?
There are such things as credit default swaps.
What do they do? I mean, that's people often say, "Oh, come on, what does that mean? What is a credit default swap, and can I buy one?"
Let's see. You could buy one on me. If you were going to bet with somebody, you'd have to find a broker, but you could make a bet that Bethany's earnings were going to deteriorate dramatically in the wake of her book coming out, that this book is not going to be a success. And so you could buy an instrument that would pay you if I crash and burn. And that would be a credit default swap. You'd have to find somebody who's willing to take the other side of the bet, who is going to say, no, Bethany McLean is going to excel. And then you'd basically set up a contract between the two of you in which you'd agree on payments to be made and objective measures of my success or failure.
Isn't this just gambling?
You know, it didn't start out as gambling. Nothing on Wall Street ever does. So it started out as fairly legitimate. Say I'm Bethany McLean. I might want to buy a credit default swap on myself, because then, should I crash and burn, I have protection. I have something that pays me, that compensates me for my crashing and burning. So if you have a Wall Street firm that has made a loan to General Motors and has General Motors debt on its books, and they can buy an instrument that protects them should General Motors default, well, you can see that's legitimate. But like everything on Wall Street, something that starts as a good idea gets taken to a speculative frenzy. And so credit default swaps eventually became a means of betting on the demise of companies that one had no connection to the underlying debt, and of structuring these just insanely complex investments based on mortgages.
Now, you were, the last time I talked, big on selling short, or not selling short, but having short sellers.
Yep.
And have you changed your mind on that? And if you haven't, why not? And explain what they do.
Sure. I think it's a complicated question. In the stock market, I am a fan of short sellers. And what short sellers do is they basically are betting that the stock of a company is going to go down. And because they are making this bet, they do detailed, extensive research in order to uncover financial frauds, in order to uncover weakness in a company's accounting. And they do the sort of research that most people in the market don't do, because, face it, we live in an economy where everybody wants things to go up. And that leads to frauds going unnoticed, because most frauds, like Enron, take the complicity of the victim, and the victims are all too willing to be complicit because all of our money is in it as well. And I think short sellers provide an incredibly important leavening force against that. you really have to think twice about that when it comes to mortgage-backed securities. In an ideal world, the fact that there were people shorting the mortgage market would have sent a signal to everybody saying, wow, there are all these smart investors who think this thing is going to crash and burn. But the market was opaque enough that you couldn't see that the way you can see it in the stock market. And because of the way these instruments work, you were basically not betting on real mortgages, but rather you were inventing on the casino version of a mortgage. So it ended up multiplying the exposure to mortgages, to souring mortgages that was out there, and multiplying the damage done by the financial crisis. And I'm not sure, it's hard for me to argue the social utility of it in the mortgage industry.
Can you still buy a subprime mortgage?
Can you still buy a I don't think so. There may be a little bit. I've heard rumors of subprime lending coming back around the edges.
Explain what a subprime mortgage is.
So a subprime mortgage is basically a mortgage made to anybody with a low credit score. It used to be anybody who didn't qualify for a Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac mortgage, anybody who didn't qualify for a conventional mortgage. So you probably paid a higher interest rate. Your mortgage might have some special fees that applied to it, and the higher interest rate was supposed to be because you were a worse credit risk, but you could still get credit by getting a subprime mortgage. And once again, in theory and in balance, that's a great idea. Do we, as a Fannie Mae executive said to me, do we want to live in a country where because you have a blemish on your credit, you can never own a house? Well, no, probably not. But balance seems to be a thing that's all too often missing in this world, and things are created and they go to extremes without ever pausing at sort of the proper middle.
You have a chapter, Why Everyone Loves Moody's. Mm-hmm. Or loved Moody's.
Loved Moody's. I think past tense is operative.
Or is it? I mean, don't they still rate?
That's a good question.
And explain, Moody's, Fitch, S&P.
Yeah. These are the so-called credit rating agencies, and they are, to most people, they were a hidden but very powerful part of the financial, of the machinery of the financial markets. They rate debt, so they're supposed to be able to tell you when debt is going to be paid back on time and in full. And a AAA rating, which the United States has, perhaps arguably today, but which the United States has, basically means that you're pretty assured of getting your money back. And AAAs were supposed to be handed out very sparingly. I think. Oh, I'm going to get the number wrong. We have it in the book, but less than a dozen corporations warranted a AAA rating. And the credit rating agencies are funny because this ability to rate debt makes them incredibly powerful, because as a company you can't sell debt sometimes without their approval. I mean, their staff, they're not flashy like Wall Street firms. People there are kind of academic, kind of nerdy, kind of staid. They never made the salaries that people on Wall Street did. So they were really kind of the little gremlins down in the basement making the gears work. But with the advent of this thing called structured finance, which is making securities out of mortgages, they became incredibly even more powerful than they were, because the whole purpose of securitization was to take something that was risky, a subprime mortgage, and turn it into something that looked really safe. And in order to do that, you needed the stamp of approval of the credit rating agencies. And it was Moody's and S&P and Fitch who rated just mammoth portions of these mortgage-backed securities with a AAA rating. They handed them out like candy. So this once pristine, really highly cherished rating really became quite degraded over the years.
You talk about a man named Brian Clarkson. Mm-hmm. Why?
A lot of people, in the end, changes in culture are often traced to one person, and never fails to be remarkable to me the impact that one powerful person can have on the character of an organization, whether it's Stan O'Neill at Merrill Lynch or Brian Clarkson at Moody's. And
just to put the vernacular on, you say he had a reputation for being nasty.
Yes, many former people at Moody's point to him as the source of a cultural change at Moody's. Moody's used to pride itself on basically, we don't care what issuers, the investment banks, the companies whose bonds we rate, we don't care what you think. We're all about serving investors, the people who buy this debt. And if you, the issuers, don't like us despite the fact that you pay us, that's your problem. And under Brian Clarkson, the culture really began to change, where Moody's really began to care about what the issuers thought, and they began to care about what the issuers, their investment banking clients, in the case of mortgage-backed securities, thought more than they did the investors who were buying these things at the end of the day.
So today, credit default swaps, derivatives, CDOs, all this. If you're an investor today and you look out at the world, do you try to get a mortgage? Do you trust that? I mean, help us out here. Are we safer in any way? I mean, Frank Rich says we're not.
I don't think we're safer in any way. I have to agree with Frank Rich on that. Well, I think it's two separate issues. With all these complex financial products, I don't see why anybody in the world would want to own the stock of a financial company. There's just absolutely no way. If this crisis proved anything, it's that nobody on the outside can tell what's going on the inside of these companies, and that the balance sheets and financial statements of these companies may have absolutely nothing to do with reality. And I think that's really scary for our system. So that's one issue. And then on the second issue, as a consumer, can you trust the financial products that people are selling you? Can you trust the people who are selling you these things to do the right thing? Well, clearly the answer is no. And one of the most stunning moments to me in the book was these internal Washington Mutual presentations showing how Washington Mutual tried to get customers who wanted a safe 30-year fixed rate mortgage to take out an option arm instead, because Washington Mutual could turn around and sell that option arm for a higher profit to Wall Street. And it would be consumers saying, well, but I like paying off my mortgage every month, and these things are dangerous, and the Washington Mutual person coming up with ways to overcome those objections. You know, if to me, it's all in the marketing and the honesty of the marketing. If your real estate, the person who was giving you a mortgage said to you, you know what, I'm not working in your best interest. I'm going to try to get you to take the highest price product I possibly can, because that's where my self-interest lies, and look out for yourself. You know, I guess I'd be fine with it, but it's the hypocrisy that people pretend to be your friend and to be doing this in your financial best interest, and they're not.
Where does this come from, in your opinion? I mean, we like to think of ourselves as a country as doing good, and we like to think of ourselves as being good people. And you start in Washington, go up the East Coast, and all you see is this kind of thing that we've been talking about. What happened?
I don't know. I obviously wasn't around 40 years ago, so I don't know if this mythology of America is mythology, and if we were never really that way, or if there's some truth to it. I do think, though, that part of it is the story of modernization and globalization, and that the bigger a society we live in, the less people feel personally accountable. And the less people feel personally accountable, the more leeway there often is in their actions. And it's why I think the corporate world has to be structured in a way that incentives are all. People will do what they're paid to do. And I'm not sure that incentive structure has changed.
Looking back on your own career, the book on Enron, The Smartest Guys in the Room, how did it sell? How well?
I think it sold pretty well. It was a strange book in that it sold really well over time. So I don't think it ever made the top 10 on a bestseller list. Maybe it did. I'm not sure. But it sold consistently for a period of time.
Would it be 50,000 copies or more than that?
I think more than that, but I'd have to ask my publisher.
You're working on an HBO movie, Too Big to Fail.
Yep.
Andrew Ross Sorkin's bestseller.
Yep.
I mean, did you find yourself in the middle of saying, why am I not representing my own book, because you've got these characters in your own book? I think there's always a little bit of ego involved in anything, right? Of course, you could say at the end of the day, I wish it were All the Devils Were Here. But Andrew's book is this cinematic, amazing play-by-play of the events on Wall Street as it unfolded, and I think that's an easier story to tell in film than the book we wrote is. And Andrew's book was done when HBO wanted to make its movie, and our book was not done. So it's kind of hard to quibble when you don't have a manuscript to turn over to anyone. And I think it'll be a great film. And have you already worked on it? Yeah. How do they use you in something like that? You really tried as much as you can to. I talked a bunch to the screenwriter about issues in the subprime lending industry, about characters, people that I got to know during the course of the book that I might have some insight into how they were being portrayed. For example, Hank Paulson figures pretty prominently.
in the movie Too Big to Fail, and Paulson's also a fairly prominent character in our book. So I have, some insight, hopefully, into how he works.
What grade would you give Hank Paulson as Secretary of the Treasury?
I think it's a very tough question, because I think that Paulson, in retrospect, it is very easy to poke holes in everything Paulson did. I do not believe that he ever operated in a way that he thought wasn't in the best interest of the country. That doesn't mean what he did was in the best interest of the country, but I firmly believe that he thought it was. I also think that he stepped into a situation that was about ready to explode when he stepped in as Treasury Secretary. And so to put the weight of the financial crisis on him, because he became the most visible force as it exploded, I think is unfair. I think you can ask questions about Paulson's role at Goldman Sachs and why, when he felt so strongly about certain issues, he didn't raise them more when he was the CEO of Wall Street's most prestigious firm. But to me, it's difficult to deeply criticize his actions as Treasury Secretary. To put it a different way, I'm not sure I would want to replay those events with a different person as Treasury Secretary. I'm not sure I wouldn't, but I'm not sure I would.
So, given what we've talked about, the revolving door in Washington, from the financial community to these important jobs in this town, who's the best kind of person? Where should you get the person to run these organizations, if not from the financial industry?
I think it's a really tough question. I think that you want somebody who is both knowledgeable and an independent thinker, and the second is very, very hard to find. Most people like to think like other people, and there's a sort of groupthink mentality that takes over. And when you do meet skeptics, like some of the ones profiled in our book, they're often a little bit out there. Whistleblowers are often kind of weird figures. They're not the sort of people who blend into a mainstream discussion, because they're always saying, wait, what about this, and what about that? And I guess if I come away from this and the Enron story with one sort of pleading, it's that to listen to the skeptics and to try to find people for those roles who have an ability to think independently.
You're married to the Enron prosecutor?
Yes, I am.
His name?
Sean Berkowitz.
And what have you learned about the business of prosecuting since you've been married to him?
Well, my husband, after leaving the government, went to a law firm where he does defense work now. So it's an interesting change in perspective, I guess, and I think I understand a lot more clearly the issues between ethical wrongdoing and criminal wrongdoing. And some of the other side of the story, that often when you have a very unsympathetic character, it doesn't make its way into the public narrative. And I think I have more appreciation for the complexities of the law.
Our guest, Bethany McLean, the book All the Devils Are Here, The Hidden History of the Financial Crisis. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
For a DVD copy of this program, call 1-877-662-7726. For free transcripts or to give us your comments about this program, visit us at qna.org. Q&A programs are also available as C-SPAN podcasts.
Next, Deputy Prime Minister